Hey everyone, and welcome back to Experiencing the City with Michael Matheny. That is me. Today I'm going to talk to you about Bruges and Brussels, Belgium. I gotta tell you right off the bat that Belgium is not a country that I ever expected to capture my love in the way that it did, but as often happens in my global and sometimes even domestic travel, I was completely taken by surprise. Belgium has, at least at the time of this recording, become one of my favorite countries I've ever visited. It's relatively flat, it's unimposing, and it's often overlooked in favor of its neighbors of France and Germany and the Netherlands. And it isn't super striking, in terms of natural features or globally renowned tourist attractions, but it was relaxed. It was medievally era preserved. It was quintessentially European. And so, as I described in a text to my mom during an afternoon stroll through the center of Brussels, Belgium just has a cheerful glow about it. It's like a drunk dude on Belgian beer eating a Belgian waffle and fries. Capturing this atmosphere and feeling isn't possible just in pictures and videos alone. It takes an understanding of the sounds, the sensations, the tastes, the ambiances that surround you as you explore the medieval port towns and the cosmopolitan hubs of Belgium. And that's what I'm going to attempt to bring to you here. What does it feel like to wander the tight alleyways in Brussels? What kind of scents fill your nose when you sit in the central square of Bruges? What sounds tell you the bigger story behind the carefully framed videos and pictures you'll see on the screen? So let's start in Bruges, which is one of the world's most well-preserved medieval towns. We'll start first with a sight that you'll capture when in Bruges. So if you've seen the 2008 film In Bruges, then you know that the town is meant to feel just like a fairy tale. And the reality is, Bruges does feel like a medieval fairy tale. There are winding canals, swans, well-preserved castles, medieval homes, cathedrals, and nearly all of the streets and bridges are made of cobbled stones. And in the wise words of Harry from In Bruges, how could that not be somebody's fucking thing, eh? There are ancient taverns nearly everywhere to be found as you turn the many corners of the city. Café Vlissinghe, I think I'm pronouncing that right, is the oldest tavern in Bruges and opened in 1515. It was actually built in 1485. The atmosphere is incredibly medieval. You've got wood-beamed ceilings, you've got plastered stone walls, animal horns above this just magnificent fireplace, and age-old cast-iron trinkets that are just kind of scattered all over the place. The only 21st century twist to this space were the fact that there was electricity and the fact that the music playing in the background is like a blend of adult contemporary. You might hear like Maroon 5 or The Fray, so that kind of messes with the ambience a little bit, but nonetheless. Bruges is exceptionally clean too, at least in the city center. Right, litter is rare, graffiti is even more rare. Bruges might be a smaller city, but some of the things that you can visit there are truly remarkable. Truly. For example, the Basilica of the Holy Blood contains a cloth stained with what is said to be the blood of Christ himself. And I couldn't take a picture or a video of the cloth, but it is a very surreal feeling, and I don't think it quite hits you until well after the fact that might well be the blood of Christ on that cloth, and so I think that was amazing, and it's in Bruges, of all places. The city is surrounded by this big wide canal and really lush park, and it's called the Ring. Here you'll find runners, people walking their dogs, you'll see swans, a light fog that's kind of misting above the water. You have old, humongous trees, these swaths of bright green grass, and most importantly, the windmills. So the classic wooden windmills, these large wooden windmills, are a hallmark of Dutch and German culture, and the Dutch make up the majority of the province of Flanders, and these windmills are straight off of a postcard. And it's incredible. You can stop and just stare at them for, I would say, hours, but I didn't do that. I probably could have. And there are people picnicking out beside them and kind of looking up at them. So they're pretty. And, the architecture in Bruges is also very much Dutch, and it's quite distinctive. So as you're strolling through the cobbled streets, or you're drifting along one of the canals through the city, you'll notice that many of the houses have roof lines that feature kind of steps up to the top. And it was thought in medieval times that the more steps and height climbing up to the point of the roof, the closer the owner was to God. And as with much of medieval architecture, the buildings and the houses throughout the city are made from either brick or stone. And Bruges is a very quiet city. There's something to keep in mind as you kind of imagine yourself walking through these cobbled streets and perusing down the canals. What that really means, of course, is that there aren't a lot of cars, right? Cities aren't loud, cars are loud. We need to get rid of them. That's a separate soapbox. So what do you hear echoing through the stone-covered alleyways and canals? Well, you hear bells chiming every 15 minutes. You hear pedestrians wandering around on cobbled stones. You hear people talking and laughing. You hear birds chirping, water rippling from the wind and from the boats going through the canals. When cars do make noise in the city, it's startling and abrupt. But I see that as a good thing because that means it's rare. And Belgium has 3 official languages. You have Dutch, French, and German. And you hear all 3, and a lot of things, of course, are written in English as well. And Bruges is in the Flanders region, which is Dutch-speaking, but there are quite a lot of tourists in town, and that kind of keeps the languages and the accents that you'll hear on the streets and in the cafes and restaurants quite diverse. Bruges smells faintly of fresh-baked bread, sugar, aged wood, fish, chocolate, and damp stone. Sometimes all at once, sometimes in buckets. But if I were to make a Bruges scented candle to really capture this, I would probably utilize all of those scents. Except the fish. Speaking of the smell of chocolate, when I say there are a ton of chocolate shops, I mean a ton. Especially towards the city center. And it feels as if every other storefront is a Belgian chocolatier, and stopping in each one of them is seriously tempting. Even if you're not going to buy anything, you just want to look at them. And they smell absolutely amazing. It's amazing that I didn't buy more chocolate than I did. So you kind of have a sense of your surroundings. What they look like, what they smell like, what they feel like. The weather in this city is something that you have to take into consideration when trying to place yourself in this environment. The reality is, like most of Europe, the weather is a bit on and off. In the springtime, when I was there, it can be pretty warm and sunny during the day. That can be broken up with random periods of heavy rain. So if you're from Florida, for example, you get it. Although it feels nothing like Florida, I should add. And by the evening, you probably need a light jacket. And that said, it's never uncomfortable. The air is light, it's not humid, there's a consistently light breeze, there's nothing intense. It feels all around very balanced in Bruges. Now, of course, as I'm talking about Belgium, I gotta talk about the food. The first meal I ate in Bruges was a Flemish stew. I ate it right in the center square. So the beef stew was really hearty, it was really thickly sauced, it was served on a plate with fries and mayonnaise, and the fries are a Belgian staple. I'll touch on that in a little bit. At Café Wissingje, I perhaps pronounced that wrong, the medieval cafe I mentioned before, I was floored by the vissoep soup. Now, this is a traditional Belgian stew. It's pretty simple. It's got fish, vegetables, and this really rich broth, but it makes a huge impact. And at the cafe, the soup came with a heaping scoop of mozzarella cheese and fresh bread, which was eventually used to soak up the rest of the broth because it was that good. A local and popular beer in Bruges and throughout Belgium is the Brugesop Blonde. And this golden beer is a little hoppy, pretty sweet, pretty fruity, but it pairs really well with the white bread, the baguette, and weirdly well with the vissoep soup. I could really see myself living in Bruges, and perhaps I will. But I was only in Bruges for a couple of days, and although I could have certainly stayed much, much longer, and I plan to return at some point for a longer visit, Bruges was only one piece of my Belgian adventure, which continued in the capital city, Brussels. So, Brussels, like Bruges, is exceptionally beautiful. There are parts of the city that, especially near the European Union buildings, aren't as medieval and Renaissance. They actually quite reminded me a lot of my current home city of Washington, D.C. in the United States. So the area that reminds me a lot of D.C. is known as the European Quarter. It's kind of separate from the historic city center, and it's packed with a lot of low-rise, boxy buildings along these really wide boulevards, and has more traditional architecture mixed in with modern glass and steel, and a lot of security guards everywhere. Um, the area isn't all stiff in government. However, there is a really large green park with a ton of old trees and ponds and things like that that's encompassed by several free museums, including the European History Museum and the Parliamentarium, neither of which take super long to get through, and they're packed with really interesting insights both into Europe's past and also their present. So I do think that was really fascinating. But as you get away from the government and the business districts, the rest of the city is absolutely magnificent. If you've read on the internet that Brussels is dull or boring or simply a government city, the author has probably only hung around the European quarter. The other parts of the city are adorned with the most Art Nouveau, Beaux Arts architecture I have ever seen. The buildings lining the winding streets, which are usually around 6 stories tall, are just incredibly ornate and detailed and simply majestic. And this is the most obvious and grand place at the center of the city, which is the most gold-plated square I have ever seen. Every facade surrounding the square is adorned in gold accents. It's almost impossible to take in. You find yourself staring at each individual facade, just attempting to process everything you're looking at. The architecture is just the most detailed, crafted, ornamental architecture I've ever seen. You've got golden statues and gargoyles, these cobbled stones on the square, just colorful hanging planters, columns adorned with golden leaves, towering spires with dozens of decorative elements, bronze, and arches of varying shapes. It's just a visual feast, and hard to take in all at once. Despite being a modern metropolis, especially as compared to Bruges, there are still plenty of winding cobbled streets here that surprise you at every turn, which is one of the best things about European cities, is you really don't know what you're gonna get when you make a turn. And being the capital city of Belgium, there are plenty of Belgian chocolate shops and storefronts full of Belgian souvenirs. The most common tourist theme to be found in the city is in fact the rendition, or smaller renditions, of Mannequin Piss, a small but famous little fountain featuring a statue of a baby peeing, all while looking incredibly jolly. The statue is very small in person, but it's amazing how many people crowd around the iron gate guarding it just to watch the fountain flow. There are several peeing statues around Brussels. I think there's 5. Another notable one includes a dog and a fire hydrant, so I was lucky enough to find that one. I missed 3. Speaking of peeing statues, I personally found that Brussels is just the right amount of dirty. It is not squeaky clean, so it doesn't feel sterile and polished, like it's a city that's just there for tourists. Brussels is first and foremost a city that is there for the people who live there. So there's graffiti, not too much. There's plenty of street art, which is really interesting to look at. So all in all, I think it's well balanced. And Brussels is a spread out place too, despite its really dense city center, so the Brussels metro system is pretty high caliber, and it makes getting to the further out places kind of a breeze. A place that was a bit out of the way, but was made really simple to get to by metro is called the Atomium, which is a landmark for Brussels. It's this gigantic metallic structure that's shaped like a unit cell, so it has the different kind of spheres in which each sphere is actually a room. And the connecting links between the different spheres are actually escalators. It's how you get in between them. And though it was a distance out, this offered really incredible views of just the Belgian landscape. And it also had some really cool laser light shows going on inside. So I thought that was pretty awesome, pretty fascinating. Definitely worth a visit. So also, like many other international cities, like New York, London, and Dubai, Brussels is very cosmopolitan. Okay, like you will hear dozens of accents. You'll see, cultural ethnicities and foods and shops from everywhere around the world, right? But it still has a really strong Belgian sense to it. There are waffle shops, chocolatiers, beer gardens featuring Delirium, which is, I think they have more beer on tap than anywhere else in the world. Fry stands, outdoor dining terraces everywhere you turn, and just a generally jolly atmosphere. And that really balances out that cosmopolitan nature of the city, and it keeps you very much assured of where you are, which is Belgium. And it almost feels as if Bruges were big, much more modern, and just more poppin', which may or may not be a good thing depending on your preference for the serenity and the quiet. Like that said, Brussels isn't a particularly loud place, which is relatively common in European cities where the car hasn't completely taken over the human experience. Again, soapbox, I won't get on that. But especially during the afternoon and evening, the city is alive with laughter, pedestrians walking, the clinging of silverware on the outdoor patios, and a generous mix of language. And occasionally you'll hear street music that's generally by guitarists or accordion players, which is fun to listen to. So Brussels is its own city-state, kind of like Washington, D.C. in a sense. And so despite being surrounded by the Dutch-speaking Flanders region, it's its own region, and it's primarily French-speaking in Brussels. So that said, though, you do get a really solid mix of both languages because it represents the whole country. And of course, that's sprinkled in with dozens of other languages from international tourists and expats. Like Bruges, Brussels also smells of fresh Belgian waffles and chocolates and stone. But here you've got to add in the occasional cigarette smoke, auto fumes, and pee, and something citrusy. I really wasn't able to figure out what that was or where it was coming from, but citrusy. And that said, if I were to make a candle just based on Belgium specifically, it would smell of fresh water, stone, Belgian waffles, blonde ales, and chocolate. So like Bruges, Brussels isn't super far from Bruges. The Brussels weather is a bit of a hit or miss in terms of whether or not it's enjoyable to be outside. Fortunately, it never got uncomfortably warm, and it was only a bit chilly when it was raining. And like in Bruges, the humidity is low thanks to the continental climate. The air always feels very sharp and crisp. So remember how I mentioned all the amazing storefronts and scents that make Brussels feel so distinctively Belgian? Yeah. The food here may be the best cuisine I have ever experienced. I mean that. So here's a fun fact. French fries were invented in Belgium. And you will understand, the moment you taste them, why Belgium is so proud of this fact. So street vendors, they'll sell the fries in cones, right? Like paper cones. And they drench them in varying different types of sauce options depending on what your preference is. But they're cooked in a very specific way that makes them very distinctive. The fries are first cooked in a low temperature oil, and then they're transferred to a drying tray to cool, and then they're refried for a shorter time but in a much hotter oil. And that's how they get their distinctive crunch and taste. And the fries, or frites, from Fritere Tabora were the perfect amount of crunchy. And the andouille sauce was abundant, lathered on there. It tasted kind of like a better version of Zax sauce, for those of you familiar with Zaxby's and Zax sauce. Also, there were Belgian waffle stands everywhere in the city, which is half of the reason the place smells like Belgian waffles. I proudly ate over a dozen during my time in Brussels. My favorite was called the banana split Liège waffle from the Waffle Factory, which is in central Brussels, and it was heaven. The waffle itself was kind of like a caramelized waffle, it seemed, but it was loaded with bananas, Belgian chocolate, and whipped cream. It felt perfect. Another interesting Belgian delicacy that I really enjoyed was called waterzooi. And this soup is creamy, but it's light, and it's filled with chicken, vegetables, potatoes, and then a really light, creamy broth. And on the side is a very fresh baguette. I watched them walk this fresh baguette in. That's how I know. And another Belgian food that I really loved, and I'm going to try to make it home, is called stomp, or it's S-T-O-E-M-P, stomp. Which is basically like a mashed potato dish with vegetables inside the mashed potatoes, and a very interesting gravy that goes on top of it, and just a big fat bratwurst that goes on top. And a random thought that consistently ran through my mind in Brussels, and in Belgium overall, was just how incredibly kind people are. Genuinely, I have never felt so comfortable and at peace with everyone around me. And to add to some of my final thoughts on my first visit to Belgium, this is an amazing place. It's such a fun, safe, laid-back atmosphere. You don't feel tense. It doesn't feel like anything is moving. Go. Everyone's just jolly. For a national capital and for the de facto capital of the European Union, there are very few places that feel super stuffy. And that's the European Quarter and the Financial District. And I mean, it's true of government and finance literally anywhere. The food is hearty and wholesome and superb. The people aren't judgmental. There's a great deal of diversity just in offerings and food and stores and language. The metro system is efficient and clean. The architecture is gorgeous. Infrastructure is top notch. And hey, I like their flag. They have a great flag. So I hope that through this video you were able to kind of bring Belgium to life in your mind and experience some of the video and photography immersively. I cannot recommend an extensive visit to this small, humble country enough. And I hope that if you visit, you'll fall in love with Belgium as much as I have. Thanks so much for watching.